So in a previous screencast-o-matic, we covered some of the causes of declining biodiversity, including habitat loss and invasive species. So now we're looking at the third cause, which is pollution. The pollution is on land, air, and in water, and it is toxic contaminants such as pesticides, heavy metals, acids, and oil spills. Oil spills may damage entire ecosystems in ways that are not fully apparent for decades. We've seen that, of course, with the Gulf oil spill, and of course the one up with the Exxon Valdez up in Alaska. And again, one thing I would like to point out is the P in HIPCO stands for pollution. It does not stand for population or human population size. But human population size underlies all of these other factors. It underlies the amount of pollution, the amount of habitat destruction, the amount of invasive species that brought in, etc. So remember, the P here stands for pollution. Okay, climate change is a topic that we'll talk about next week in much more detail. But climate change, it affects biodiversity. And we will look at how it will affect. And first of all, remember, climate change means change in temperature and precipitation of various habitats. And one of the biggest questions is how quickly that warming effect happens. So if you have a species that can migrate, such as a bird, or they can move to a new territory, if it's, if something warms 2 degrees, no big deal, it can spread. If you're talking about a species such as a plant, it can only spread its seeds a certain distance each year. So if climate changes slowly, the plant each year during its season of reproduction can move further and further into the area which is appropriate for it temperature and precipitation wise. But if climate change occurs rapidly, the plants can't keep up with moving to the habitat that it needs. And as you recall from before, it's the plants as well as the temperature and precipitation which determine what other organisms can live there. For example, what animals can live there. So we will look at the impact on biodiversity again next week. A good example, though, to keep in mind of a change that we've already seen is with coral. Coral is susceptible to just 2 degrees centigrade change in water temperature, and that has happened in various parts of the world. And if it happens just for one season, the coral bleaches, but it may come back. If it happens for multiple years, then the coral dies permanently. So that's, again, something we'll look at, but certainly something to keep in mind. Next, we have a very disturbing cause of declining biodiversity, and that is overharvesting. So first, the definition. When individuals of a species are removed, which means killed, at a rate faster than the population can replace. And examples of overharvesting are numerous. We have the example of the dodo bird shown here in the graphic on the right. The dodo bird was a large flightless bird, and when humans on ships first arrived on the islands that had these dodo birds, the birds were not used to them as predators. They didn't have any predators, actually. And so when humans went after the dodo birds and their eggs, and when rats and other rodents from the ship also went after the birds' eggs, they became extinct. We'll look at 2 more recent examples of overharvesting: the American bison, buffalo, and the passenger pigeon, and what happened with those organisms that are, the passenger pigeon is extinct, the American bison is not extinct, but it's certainly been threatened. So first, let's look at the bison. In the early 1800s, there were over 50 million American bison. By the end of the 1800s, there were fewer than 1,000. So think about it. In 100 years, they went from 50 million to 1,000. So you might wonder how that happened. Well, it's a very unfortunate story. Native Americans relied on bison to provide food and also to provide their hides for warmth and other uses. And at the time, the U.S. government wanted to move Native Americans to reservations. So, an effort led by General Sherman was to eradicate the bison so that the Native Americans did not have access to this food and other leather goods, etc., source. And so they paid people, bounty hunters basically, like Buffalo Bill, to go out and just shoot all the bison that they could find. And at the time, this was the beginning of photography, and there are actual photographs that you can find online if you're interested, where people like Buffalo Bill are standing up on a huge pile of carcasses. And the meat wasn't even used, say, to go to U.S. soldiers. It was just left there to rot. And so that's how we got from 50 million down to 1,000. Today, let's see, I believe, yes, there are 200,000 American bison present in the United States and Canada. Mostly they are on reserves or farms, protected areas or farms, but there has been some recovery. Let me go back a slide to the passenger pigeon. So the passenger pigeon was a bird that also was referred to sometimes as a dove, but it wasn't actually a dove. And they used to be so numerous over the United States that some people called them a plague of doves because huge, huge flocks of birds would descend on American farms and compete with what we were growing as crops. And so they were not a welcome guest, and American farmers shot passenger pigeons. The passenger pigeons were used for other things too. The bones were used as fertilizer, and the feathers were used as decorations in hats, for example. But even when their numbers decreased to numbers where they weren't of threat to our crops, people continued to hunt them for the other reason and also just as sport hunting. And the sad part here was that passenger pigeons are particularly easy to hunt. You may have heard the term stool pigeon. So that came from the idea of a passenger pigeon. And what hunters would do would be capture one pigeon and tie it to a stool. And the other passenger pigeons would gather all around trying to figure out, what's going on with this bird? Why can't it fly? What can we do? Blah, blah, blah. And as the other passenger pigeon flock gathered around, then the hunters would take large nets and just swoop them all up for the killing. So I think the last one died in the 1950s, as I recall, shot by like a 12-year-old boy whose dad was very proud, apparently. Okay, so that's overharvesting. And that there are many examples, of course. We talked before about how, for example, fish stocks can be depleted to half the population size, or they no longer can reproduce. So there are many examples of overharvesting, though this isn't the biggest cause of declining biodiversity. It's certainly one that we could manage instead of just letting it happen. All right. So let me pause for just a second while I see where I want to go with these slides. So since biodiversity has been declining so markedly, people have turned to looking at ways to conserve. And there are two basic approaches. The first approach is the single species approach, where we focus our protection efforts on a single species or even a small group of related species. Now, you don't need to memorize these, that's why they're in black and white, but you can see that even beginning in the 1900s, there were various legislative and global efforts to protect species beginning in 1900, where illegally harvested game was not allowed to cross state lines. And then moving internationally, the UN put together a treaty on preventing trade in endangered species of flora and fauna, which means plants and animals. And many, many countries are now signed on to that. And then there was another effort that was from an organization, not a government effort, called the Red List, where member countries sent people, representatives, sort of like they do now for climate change, to regulate the import and export of species on the list. And these efforts have been helpful. So, one of the most important pieces of conservation legislation in the United States is the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So that prohibits the killing of all marine mammals in the United States and prohibits the import or export of marine mammal body parts. So what are marine mammals? They're mammals, so they are animals that, like us, have hair or fur, give birth to their young, take care of their young, provide breast milk, etc. And marine meaning that they live in the ocean water, salt water. And the group of species includes little things like the sea otter here shown on the left, which you might find in California, and also seals and sea lions. So as you're probably well aware, there was a big effort to do this here that affected Cape Cod because the seals multiplied quite substantially here on Cape Cod and on various tiny islands around Cape Cod. And when we tried to protect the seals and their populations resurged, it also brought sharks. And originally, there were not that many people on Cape Cod, so there may have been seals, there may have been sharks for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We don't really know because there weren't that many people here, and much less all the tourists and windsurfers, etc., in the water. So I guess the biggest lesson here is that though this was very important legislation, and it did provide many protections and kept species from becoming extinct, it's very hard to manage nature because it's such a complex web. And so you think you fix one piece of it, like let's protect the seals, but then you can affect the whole ecosystem. And you probably know, but seals have been well known for eating large numbers of fish, large numbers. And that affects the number of fish in the ecosystem, which affects us commercially, but it also affects the ecosystem in general. Okay, let's try to get this last slide in here about single species approach. And that's the Endangered Species Act, another very important piece of legislation, first passed in 1973. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was charged with determining which species should be listed as threatened or the more serious category endangered and prohibit the harming of these species. So the act authorizes government to purchase habitat that is critical to the species. That can be problematic. It takes a very long process to get a species onto the Endangered Species Act. Some have been successful. So I'll give you a successful example, and that would be the American alligator that lived in Florida in the Everglades. And it was hunted for its leather, and you could also eat the meat, but basically it was for the leather. And due to changes to its habitat, basically habitat degradation by not allowing the full water flow through the Everglades that used to take place, and the overhunting, it became an endangered species. It has now returned and is no longer endangered. So again, we have to go through a lengthy process to remove it from the endangered species list and allow another species to move onto the list. So there have been successes, certainly, absolutely, and that's good. But many people look at more of an ecosystem approach, which we'll look at next, to try to get past some of the hiccups that occur when you look at a single species.